Well, the case of Sam Bankman-Fried highlights how cryptocurrency is being used more and more to commit crimes. The untraceable currency can be used for money laundering, as we've seen, and even for financing terrorism. We get more on that part of the story from Siobhan Silke.
They once dealt in sacks of cash, but these days crypto is increasingly the currency of choice for criminals. It's typically linked to fraud, ransomware attacks, the narcotics trade and the exchange of child abuse images. But armed groups are also using crypto networks to help finance their activities. It's unknown just how much terrorism funding flows through the cryptocurrency space. In 2022, a UN official said up to a fifth of terrorist attacks could be linked to crypto financing, but other experts put the figure much lower. In any case, US and Israeli authorities are taking it extremely seriously. Hamas is known to have been using crypto since 2019. The Palestinian group has solicited cryptocurrency donations on social media, including, according to Israeli police, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th attacks. In the following days, Israel froze multiple cryptocurrency accounts believed to belong to Hamas. It wasn't the first time the country had targeted accounts linked to militant activities. Last year, its National Bureau for Counter-Terror Financing ordered the seizures of millions of euro worth of crypto wallets it said were linked to the Islamic Jihad movement, Hezbollah, and the Quds Force branch of the Iranian armed forces. The US has repeatedly targeted accounts linked to armed groups in the Middle East. The Department of Justice has seized wallets belonging to the Islamic State group, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas's military wing, the Al-Qassam Brigade. Crypto-backed funding for armed activities may be happening beyond the Middle East. Just this month, Nigerian authorities accused the crypto exchange Binance of involvement in terrorism financing. Both regular criminals and armed groups are believed to use large-scale money laundering networks to help cover their tracks. The pan-European policing agency Europol warns these networks are a significant threat. They offer services that allow other criminals to operate in the crypto space and help them to cash out their digital assets, that is, convert their crypto to hard currency.
And for more on this story, let's bring in Renato Mariotti, a former prosecutor in the U.S. Justice Department's Securities and Commodities Fraud section. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. You know, we saw Sam Bankman-Fried getting his comeuppance today. First of all, what's your reaction to this sentence of 25 years in prison?
I think it's right what I would have expected for this case. It's obviously a very substantial sentence. It's a significant sentence. But that said, this is a very large fraud, one of the largest frauds we've ever seen in the United States, and one of the largest frauds there's ever been in the world. So it's definitely a substantial offense. And frankly, despite the fact that some victims now see the prospect of getting repaid some of the money that they lost, there were still very substantial losses to victims.
In general terms, how difficult is it to catch people who are using cryptocurrency illegally and then to prosecute them?
Well, people who are, let's say, one-off criminals, you were talking about in the last segment, very, very challenging. For example, people who are using that as a way of extorting someone else, it can be challenging to trace, and that's the sort of thing that increasing law enforcement resources are being put towards in the United States. Sam Bankman-Fried is in a different category, right? He was a businessman who was not hard to find, not hard to trace, not hard to locate. And really the question was his business itself engaging in widespread fraud? And I think this was an astonishing case for the United States Justice Department, SEC, and CFTC combined to bring. The amount of resources they brought to bear were massive. And this was very quickly worked from beginning to end. If you recall, the collapse of FTX was less than 2 years ago.
Well, so these can be very sophisticated schemes. So are the authorities around the world equipped to recognize what's happening in the first place?
They're a step behind right now. But I think part of the answer is regulation and not enforcement. Okay. In other words, this is an example of the enforcement of criminal laws against a fraudster. That, I think, is uncontroversial. But in the United States, what we've been doing, at least up to date, is a lot of enforcement matters as opposed to having a comprehensive regulatory framework which, by the way, a lot of other nations have done. There are nations around the world that are adopting frameworks, that are introducing frameworks, and I do think more and more crypto uh, commerce is moving out of the United States as a result. I think that we need to have more regulation, more oversight, more monitoring of the industry, rather than a Wild West where when there is a bad actor like Sam Bankman-Fried, they ultimately are relying on criminal prosecution to make victims whole.
We know that last month Nigerian authorities clamped down on cryptocurrency firms over allegations that they were being used for, money laundering and even financing terrorism. So help us understand why cryptocurrency can be used so effectively in criminal endeavors. Is it because it's untraceable?
Well, it certainly can be more difficult to trace. That is true. Also, you can own cryptocurrency without owning a bank account, which certainly is part of its appeal, particularly in the third world. There are still many, many millions of people around the world who don't have access to banks and to bank accounts. But nonetheless, obviously, that also makes it easier for criminals to use. Obviously, at the same time, there's an upside in terms of the way in which it enables certain new technology. There's smart contract technology, for example, built into certain tokens. So there's definitely an upside. But when new technologies entered, and we saw this with the internet, when the internet first exploded, in the early days of the internet, it was a wild west. Certainly, internet fraud still exists, but law enforcement has adapted. It just took them some time to do so.
Well, so we have an international audience. So how is the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission regulating cryptocurrency? And is it similar to regulations in other parts of the world?
It's not similar. It's an important distinction. In the United States, it's not settled which regulatory body is regulating the space. And so the SEC, as you point out, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is filing lawsuits against entities at times for activity that it's not clear is illegal. There's been some real fights. There have actually been some losses by the SEC here in the United States. At the same time, in the United States, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, is also bringing lawsuits. So it's not clear to the industry what the rules are and who the regulator is. In other parts of the world, it's very different. For example, in the UK, they have a regulatory framework that is being introduced in Parliament that essentially creates a structure and has the industry regulated by one of the same bodies that's regulating other financial instruments in the UK. So I think that's an approach that other parts of the world are adopting, and I think that's why we're seeing crypto commerce leaving the United States and going to the UK, the EU, and some Asian countries.
Okay, we want to thank you so much, Renato Mariotti, a former prosecutor in the U.S. Justice Department Securities and Commodities Fraud Section. Thanks so much for sharing your insight here on France 24.
Thank you.
Well, the French president is